Drama provides the psychological nightmare on BBC Two in an hour. John Lithgow stars in the first of our twin thrillers, Raising Cain. Now BBC Two makes television history with a three-way debate from those who would be Chancellor. Peter Jay presides.
Good evening and welcome. At last the gloves are off and this is the first set-piece opportunity for the top party spokesman to meet face-to-face in the studio. The gut issue in this election, whatever other matters may have grabbed the headlines, is of course the economy. It may indeed be the key factor in deciding which party forms the next government. The central question is this: do the Conservatives, after 18 years in charge of the economy, deserve another spell in office, or do Labour or indeed the Liberal Democrats offer a preferable alternative? To help you decide, the BBC has arranged tonight's debate between the three men who would be Chancellor. Over the next hour, in front of you at home and a representative audience here in the studio, they'll try to convince you. They are, of course, the current Chancellor Kenneth Clarke, Labour's Gordon Brown, and Malcolm Bruce of the Liberal Democrats. Gentlemen, please step forward. My role in tonight's debate is to preside, to ask questions, and to see fair play. Our audience have a passive role, but they can, of course, modestly applaud, or even, if they feel so disposed, laugh. In a moment, I'll ask each of the party spokesmen to deliver a short opening statement. They have drawn lots to decide in which order they will speak. The rest of the programme will be devoted to questions on key areas of the economy, which are taxation of the government's finances, inflation and interest rates, Europe and the single currency, unemployment, and long-term growth. At the end, each will make a short closing statement, and again, the order has been determined by drawing lots. As this is meant to be a debate, I expect that each of them will wish to challenge the other from time to time, and of course, that is what we're here for. But of course, normal courtesy and rules of debate will still apply, and they'll all have broadly equal time. Now, Mr. Gordon Brown, may I ask you to start the proceedings with your opening statement?
Thank you. Britain can do better, a lot better. A new government must equip our country for the future, end the cycle of boom and bust, and build a recovery that lasts. In 18 years under the Conservatives, we've suffered two of the worst recessions we've seen since the war, and we have fallen down the World Prosperity League. These facts are indisputable. New Labour has spent 5 years developing a carefully costed programme which will ensure for our country growth that lasts. Our approach starts with stability, tough rules on spending and borrowing, and a commitment to low inflation. After 18 years, manufacturing investment is actually below the level of 1979, and on skills we are near the bottom of the European League. So we need to encourage long-term investment and the education policies at school and for training throughout the working life to give us what I want, the best skilled and educated workforce in Europe. After 18 years, 1 in 5 families has no one earning a wage, living on benefits, driving up social security bills and taxes. So we will reform the welfare state and with our carefully costed programme move the young and long-term unemployed off benefits into work. After 18 years, we are now at the fringe of Europe, yet 60% of our trade, 3.5 million jobs, depend on European markets. We will stand up for British interests and lead in Europe again. Now, just as they did at the last elections, the Conservatives are making a series of uncosted, false promises on tax and spending. They don't know how to pay for them, and these would threaten our recovery.
Gordon Brown, I must call you to conclude your remark.
I am proud that Britain has millions of enterprising, dynamic people, but it needs an enterprising and dynamic government, a Labour government, that will build prosperity that lasts.
Thank you, Gordon Brown. And now, Kenneth Clarke.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, today is April the 6th, which is the start of a new tax year. And it's the second April the 6th in succession that I've reduced the level of income tax. I've reduced the basic rate of income tax to 23 pence. Part of the economic policy of this government that allows people to keep more of their own money. But the reason I reduce taxation when I can is I think low rates of direct taxation actually improve the performance of the British economy. They're the kind of tax cuts that I've always talked about. They're tax cuts that are for real, they're tax cuts that can be afforded, they're tax cuts that will last, and they're part of a program that has been delivering jobs and prosperity, increasing the country's wealth, because we need to have a successful economic policy, because everything else flows from that. Not only jobs, not only prosperity, but all the finance for our great public services, all the things that enable us tackle problems of poverty and deprivation in this country, all the things that help to improve our quality of life and make this country a country to be proud of. The economic record over the last 5 years is an extremely good one. And what we have at the moment, as international commentators concede, is the best economic circumstances we've had for a generation. Output's almost 10% higher than it was in 1992. We're having the longest and strongest recovery of any major European economy. Unemployment's down by more than 1 million since the last election in 1992, lower than any other major European economy, and we've had the longest period of low inflation for half a century. I want to build on that. What matters is this should be kept secure. All that is based on healthy public finances, on a policy of sound monetary policy, sound economic judgment, policies that were opposed until really only a few weeks ago by both of my parliamentary colleagues on this platform.
Mr. Clarke,
they could not deliver the same performance. It's important to this country. We carry on delivering it steadily and reliably for the next 5 years.
Mr. Clarke, thank you very much. You rather overran your time, but so did Mr. Brown. Finally, Mr. Bruce.
Well, let me say, ladies and gentlemen, what makes the Liberal Democrats distinctive. That's the key issues I want to stress. We are the only party with a fully costed menu, with the prices attached, a manifesto which has been costed and which will tell you what it will cost, how it will be spent, and where the money comes from. We're also the party with the most credible policy for getting down and keeping down inflation and reducing borrowing by ensuring that we have a genuinely independent central bank, which government sets the policy for, but where day-to-day management is decided by independent specialists and not by politicians with ulterior motives. We are the only party that is in favour, in principle, of joining monetary union, provided the criteria are met by the founding members, provided they're met by the United Kingdom, and provided they're endorsed by the people of the United Kingdom in a referendum, then we believe Britain should join in the first wave. And we're the only party with a genuinely green agenda that will identify those things which we don't want, such as pollution and environmental damage, and those things that we do want, such as jobs and wealth creation, and will tax the pollution and cut the taxes on employers' national insurance and VAT. We are a party which has a clear set of priorities to ensure that the public services get the investment they need, that borrowing is brought down, and that taxes are honestly presented to you. The other parties will tell you they can bring down borrowing, they can cut taxes, and they can increase spending on public services. It doesn't add up, it doesn't make sense, you can't walk on water, and that's why fundamentally the Liberal Democrats offer a manifesto which will make the difference between the other two.
Mr. Bruce, thank you very much indeed. Now we turn to our first topic, which is tax, spending and borrowing, the government's finances. Chancellor, I come to you first, if I may. After the last election, you and your predecessor, Norman Lamont, imposed the biggest ever peacetime increase in taxes. Your own budget this year, this is the Red Book, which you will recognise, shows the national tax burden continuing to rise in each of the next 5 years to 2000-2001. So why should anyone believe your manifesto talk that you're a tax-cutting party?
Well, after the last election, the recession went on longer than most commentators, most people expected, and we were deeply in recession. And in the budgets, the first two difficult budgets that I said we had to do what was necessary to get the public finances back under control, create the conditions for strong, healthy economic recovery. We did that. We did what was necessary. We now have the strongest recovery of any major country in Western Europe. Unemployment's falling, prosperity is rising, and we're back on our tax-cutting agenda. We behaved extremely responsibly, which is why we have now produced the excellent economic conditions we have, and why we demonstrated we can resume tax cutting. You're looking at the Red Book, looking at the tax burden. Every Red Book shows the tax burden going up. I don't think I can remember a budget when it didn't. What happens is if you anticipate rising earnings, you expect rising revenues. As a percentage of GDP, tax burden now is what it was before the last election. Controlling public spending keeps the tax burden down. That's what I've been doing every budget I presented. That's why those Red Book figures, so far in my period, have always shown that actually taxes can be sustained as a proportion of the GDP. I brought it down in more recent times on the back of healthy economic recovery.
More recent times. But, Chancellor, you know as well as I do that as soon as this election is out of the way, you're going to have to increase taxes if you're still at the Treasury. There is no way that you can have a 20 billion deficit when, as you put it, Britain is booming. We're at the top of the economic cycle over which you say we should balance the budget.
No, I most firmly do not believe that. I mean, I produced figures which show plans getting down the budget to balance by the end of the century. And I think it's a sort of fashionable myth that taxes would have to go up. It's very helpful to Gordon, because I think Gordon would have to put taxes up. But I, at the moment, am reducing taxation, and if you deliver my Red Book figures, there is no need to raise taxation. It's extremely important we remain a low taxation economy. It's striving for that objective that keeps our performance high compared with other countries. And every time I've set a budget, I have kept the public finances going towards balance, steadily improved their health, and in my plans, there's no reason whatever to raise taxation. It would require exceptional events to drive us back into raising taxation, and those exceptional events are not foreseen by any sensible commentator.
Well, I won't pursue it. I'll turn...
If I may say so, Mr. Jay, the question that the Chancellor refused to ask was the first question you put, and I put to him again. Why, in 1992, did the Conservatives make promises that they would cut taxes and then break them? Why did they make promises about VAT, national insurance, the married couples allowance, mortgage tax relief, and every one of these promises was broken? And why are they now continuing to make promises about tax cuts and about spending rises that they know they cannot guarantee to deliver? Why do they not tell us where the money is coming from?
Because we were taken by surprise by the recession, as was the Labour Party. We had to get the public finances healthy to get recovery. You opposed every measure we took, Gordon. You opposed all the spending cuts. You opposed the tax increases. You now try to raise alarms about the public finances, but you don't say what you're going to do to make them even tighter, because had we followed your policies over the last 4 years, public finances would indeed now be in a mess, whereas in fact they're set towards balance by the turn of the century in a very healthy state. We have the lowest public debt of any major country in Western Europe. Indeed, I think we have the lowest in proportion of GDP of any EU country bar Luxembourg.
But I come back to the question, why did you make promises and not keep them? And why are you making promises again about tax cuts that you can't guarantee to keep? Why do you not tell us where the money is coming from? Why say you're going to cut VAT and then raise it?
Our overriding promise for the last election was on jobs, prosperity, what I always call an enterprise economy. When I presented my budgets, I explained why I was raising taxation, why I was controlling public spending ever more firmly. I said I would return to a tax-cutting agenda. I did that. 2 budgets I raised taxes, 2 budgets I reduced taxes. I reduced taxes against a background of unprecedented growth with low inflation and falling in unemployment, which is the envy of Western Europe. And until a couple of months ago, until you started making up policies, you went along on the hoof, trying to move nearer to us, you were opposing every one of those measures. You would have opposed all the things we did to get the public finances back under control. You would have opposed all we did. It's got us the present growth, falling unemployment and rising living standards.
Can I ask both of them?
Gentlemen, there is a third party present. There is Mr. Bruce, and he must have an opportunity, I'm sure he wants to explain what his party would do about the budget problem that the other two have been discussing.
Exactly so. I mean, I asked both of them, why do they promise tax cuts that they don't believe they can deliver, and according to the polls, the overwhelming population of this country do not believe will be delivered? 2/3 of people, when questioned, say they believe taxes will go up at the next election, in spite of the fact that the two parties who claim they're going to win the election are both committed to holding them down. So clearly there's an enormous breakdown of trust between these two parties and the electorate. We've made it quite clear that if people are concerned about the financial crisis in the health service and underfunding in education, and they want resources to go into that, then they have to pay more taxes in the present circumstances. We'd all like to deliver those services with reduced taxes, but until you've delivered economic performance that can sustain that, and the Tories and Labour between them have never done that, then you are not telling the truth if you say to people, we can in fact increase the spending in these areas, deliver what you want, and it won't cost you anything. It doesn't add up.
Gordon Brown, let me press you. Let me press you that you're about to repeat exactly what Kenneth Clarke and his party did in '93, namely to remain very silent about the problem during the election campaign and then to have to raise taxes sharply after you're elected, because you've said you will only borrow to invest over the life of the cycle. At this stage of the cycle, you can't possibly justify borrowing the 20 billion deficit that you'll inherit from Kenneth Clarke. So if you're consistent, you must raise taxes, and you haven't said so in your campaign.
It is precisely because of the deficit, a 26 billion deficit this year, a 19 billion deficit bequeathed by the Conservatives for next year, very sizable public borrowing figures, and a doubling of the national debt, that we have taken the tough decisions we have. First of all, work within departmental ceilings on public spending for the first 2 years. Secondly, stick to the golden rule on borrowing. Thirdly, not make the additional spending commitments that Kenneth Clarke's party has been making over these last few weeks, everything from the royal yacht to the pensions proposals. And fourthly, not make the commitments that Kenneth Clarke's party is making about tax cuts for married couples and everything else, which they know they cannot guarantee to deliver. And in the long term, our welfare to work measures are designed to cut the social security bills. You know, we spend more on unemployment now than on education. That's why we have a welfare to work programme, and that's why we'll cut the social security bills over time. It is the only way forward for this government for sound public finances.
Mr. Brown, you've got 11 billion, something like that, of borrowing which is not matched by investment. You've got $1 billion or $2 billion of privatisation receipts, which you won't have, which Kenneth Clarke's got. You've got $500 million lost through cutting VAT on fuel. You've got various other things to pay for. How, from the things you've talked about, can you possibly close a gap on that scale in the financial year, which has now already begun?
Every spending commitment we have is costed and funded. Look through our manifesto. We shift resources within existing departments. Education, the improvements in education are paid for by cancelling the assisted places scheme. The improvements in the health service are paid for by ending the Tory internal market. The improvements in employment opportunity by the windfall levy on the utilities. Look through every part of our programme, including VAT on fuel, which ought to be cut because it should never have been put on. And every part of that is properly funded. We are not making the mistake of the Conservatives, making promises that cannot be kept. The question really is one for Kenneth Clarke. Why last week did he promise that he would cut taxes, the married couples allowance? Why did he promise he would cut that when he could not tell us how it was going to be financed? The question is for him, where is the money going to come from?
Well, before he answers it, I really must give Malcolm Bruce the opportunity to answer the question about his own policy, which is, OK, he says he will increase tax by 1p in order to pay, but in order to pay for extra spending on education. So that does nothing to fill in the hole in the government's finances, the £10 billion or so, which both of these two gentlemen, and you if you find yourself as Chancellor, will face the moment you get in the Treasury with the election behind you.
Yes, we accept, first of all, that if you want to increase expenditure in the public services, you cannot borrow, so you must tax. And we've said we will do that, and how it will be done, and who will pay. We also accept that borrowing has to be brought down until we achieve balance, and then can apply the golden rule. Well, the most single difference in approach between the Liberal Democrats and the other two parties is that we would manage the economy through the independence of the central bank. And at the moment, we are paying a premium for the rights of Mr. Clarke and the aspirations of Mr. Brown to interfere on a day-to-day basis, and consequently mean that we have to pay higher interest charges, 1.75% higher than Germany, and higher than even Spain. And in these circumstances, if we transfer those decisions to an independent bank, we get an immediate benefit in lower interest charge and lower borrowing charges. For the rest, we operate within the discipline of we do not spend money we haven't identified funding for.
Mr. Clarke, I interrupted you.
Every time I take a penny off the basic rate, the Liberals say they'll put that penny back, and then they say they'll spend it. Gordon says he will raise a windfall tax equivalent to 3p on the standard rate, and he'll spend it. And they have no solutions for the problems. Indeed, as you're quite right to say, Gordon has billions of pounds worth of commitments he can't finance, billions of pounds worth of policies which are missing in the things I do to deliver the public finances that we have.
But you have a black hole.
But I have a track record of saying I would return to tax cutting only when it was affordable. I have a track record of saying I get the fiscal deficit down. I have delivered on that. My red books keep producing steadily improving public finances, and the tax cuts I've made when I was able to resume making them have been affordable, have been going to last. Nobody is going to reverse them except Malcolm, who claims he's going to spend the penny he puts back. And our fiscal deficits in the 90s are far below the ones we ran in the 80s. They're miles below
what about
the ones the
balancing
Labour
the budget?
Party
You said
ran in the 70s. And the outlook for our fiscal deficit is one of the healthiest in Western Europe. It's a myth to say it can't be delivered. It can be delivered if you carry on running the economy as we run it in the course of this Parliament.
You talk about balancing the budget, that's what you said. Now you talk about having small deficits, even when you stand in front of posters saying Britain is booming. That's when you should be repaying debt, not borrowing.
Currently, as you realise, our deficit situation is much healthier than that of many other countries in Europe, far below what it used to be, and I have plans which are accepted by international commentators as leading towards a balanced budget by the end of the century. In the course of the next Parliament, we will hit a balanced budget. And I have a history, red book by red book, of steadily improving the position so that I produced reductions in income tax in November of 1995, reductions of income tax in November 1996. Gordon can't argue with them. He couldn't make his mind up. He wouldn't vote for them. He wouldn't vote against them when I did them. All that Malcolm says is every time I take a penny off, he says that penny he'll put back and spend it.
Because you have to pay for it.
Why doesn't Mr. Clarke answer the question I put to him? The Conservatives made tax promises at the last election and broke them. They are now making a new tax promise, regardless of growth, about the married couples allowance. Will he tell us how is he going to fund this proposal? Why should we trust a word that is said about tax from the Conservatives?
We will fund the change to the married couples arrangements with children, the transferable capital allowances, as we get the improved public finances, as I financed the penny off income tax last November and the one before. That's quite... If you look 2 years ago, Gordon, you could have made the same point about the income tax reduction I made last November. It required further public spending rounds, controls of public spending, not schools, hospitals, police. I increased my... Controls of public spending which your people couldn't make, and then I delivered a penny, and you stopped voting against it. You said you didn't know one way or the other by the time I got there last November.
You say you're going to finance it. Where is the money coming from?
The money will come from good management of the public finances. That's how we got the tax cuts that you could not have made. And I don't face your problem. Your problem of promising to increase
credibility.
Where are you going to finance? Not at you. And we know you're going to raise the tax burden with the windfall tax and spend it. What about council house building? All your people keep saying £2.5 billion worth of council house building per year throughout the next Parliament. How are you going to pay for that?
Gentlemen, I've got to call you to order.
I've already said there are no public expenditure commitments that require increases in taxes. The Institute of Fiscal Studies said quite clearly our programme was costed and it added up.
There are other important matters to discuss, and one of them is inflation. There are other important people here, including Mr. Malcolm Bruce. Mr. Bruce, inflation and interest rates is our second topic. How would you control inflation? Through higher interest rates, or through incomes policy, or through higher unemployment?
Well, the first objective is we agree that there should be an inflation target. We have consistently agreed with the principle of that, although we've had a slight difference of view with the Chancellor's judgment. The Chancellor has also become slightly more relaxed about his discipline towards inflation as it's got closer towards the election. And the fact is, the decisions about interest rates as a means of bringing down inflation should be decided by independent economists at the central bank, not by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, driven by his need to get re-elected. The reality is that the bank has insisted that interest rates should have been higher. Indeed, as of today's forecast, the indications are an increase in interest rates will take place immediately after the election, and it will be higher than it would have been because the Chancellor didn't act early enough. And the second benefit is, of course, that, as I've said before, by giving the bank independence, you lower the underlying premium on the interest rates and give yourself lower borrowing and greater stability.
Can I be absolutely clear, Mr. Bruce, about where the Liberal Democrats stand? On the 10th of April next week, Mr. Clarke is going to meet with Eddie George, the Governor of the Bank of England. He is likely to repeat his advice that interest rates should be higher than they are now. If you were there in the Treasury now, you would accept that advice. In other words, you're going into an election promising to raise interest rates. Is that correct?
If an independent Bank of England determines that the interest rates are necessary to be increased to bring down inflation in the future, then that's the decision that should be taken. And when it's not taken, because it's not convenient for chancellors, we all pay because the economy gets out of control, inflation gets out of control, and we all finish up with a bust situation following a boom and higher interest rates in the long run. So there's no point in making the bank independent and then overriding them. And having discussions in public doesn't change the fundamental initiative, because Kenneth Clarke tells us, I make the decisions, and the jury is still out as to whether he's made the right decisions. But don't tell me the fact that he's 20 points behind in the polls and it's just before an election has no bearing whatsoever on his judgment.
What's so wonderful about giving the decision to the Bank of England if they repeatedly get it wrong, as many people think they have in the last few years?
Sorry, there's no evidence to suggest the Bank of England have got it wrong, because the Bank of England are making a judgment about what the rate of inflation will be in 2 years' time. According to the reports in today's papers, the economy is growing faster than the Chancellor's prediction. Inflation is in danger of getting out of control, and 6 or 12 months from now, we could be in recession because Kenneth Clarke allowed the economy to boom in advance of an election in a desperate hope for re-election. We've been through these boom-bust cycles year in, year out, and successive Labour and Conservative governments who insist that politicians should make decisions that should be left to independent professionals. Whether the bank is right or wrong is not the point. The point at the end of the day is who makes the decisions and do they make them on genuinely objective economic criteria, not short-term political ones.
Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown, please, let me ask you this. Please be absolutely frank and acknowledge that the moment you're in number 11, if you are, the very first thing you're going to have to do is raise interest rates in response to market expectations, in response to the advice of the Bank of England, in order to control inflation, in order to reassure markets that Labour is not soft on inflation. Are you not?
Well, I think Ken Clarke would agree with me that it's quite irresponsible for a Shadow Chancellor or a Chancellor to speculate about interest rate rises. It's quite irresponsible. These are decisions that have got to be made at the time with the full knowledge of events. But what I will say, you've got to create the mechanism by which you keep inflation low. First of all, the inflation target. I agree with Mr. Bruce on that. Secondly, an institutional mechanism that we have confidence in. That's why we propose reform at the Bank of England and indeed reform at the Treasury. So the expert advice is there and we have confidence in the mechanism. That has not been created under the Conservatives. And thirdly, I think most important of all, an understanding of what's caused inflation over these last few years, and it includes the neglect of investment in our economy. So every time we expand as an economy, inflationary pressures develop because there are skill shortages, bottlenecks, we import too much, and then we're back to the old stop-go. And really the question the Conservatives have got to answer is why they have been responsible for 2 of these deepest recessions over these last 18 years, and why even today long-term interest rates in this country, that is the guide to future inflationary pressures, long-term interest rates are far higher than they are in America, higher than they are in Germany and France. Why is this the case if everything is so rosy?
Before the Conservatives answer that question, let me ask you the fundamental strategic question which Labour faces. Over the last 18 years, it's really high unemployment that has held inflation in check. Labour is dedicated and committed to high and stable employment, to full employment. If you achieve that, what is going to control the inflation under those conditions, given that you reject incomes policy, which is the only known mechanism, and that's not a very successful one in those circumstances?
But the modern view is that what causes inflation and what causes unemployment is exactly the same thing. It is the lack of capacity in your economy. So without an investment-based recovery, every time you grow, you get both inflationary pressures and high unemployment. Now, we want to tackle unemployment from the supply side by the measures that will get the young and the long-term unemployed into effective work through having skills. There is no long-term trade-off between growth and unemployment. That I accept. But the causes of unemployment and the causes of inflation are low investment, and that is a problem we've got to address. We've had the lowest increase investment of all our major competitors over these 18 years, despite North Sea oil. So the question for the Conservatives, why, even last year, is manufacturing investment 8% down, manufacturing output only 1% up? Why have we had such a neglect of investment?
Chancellor, I put to you the obvious question. You've just discovered, apparently, that Britain is booming. Previously, you said it was just on sustainable growth. Now it's booming. You're going to have to bust that boom, aren't you, by raising interest rates the moment the election's behind you?
Well, firstly, that view that Gordon just put forward, I've not heard him put so clearly as that before, isn't modern. It's pretty eccentric. It's rather dangerous. The idea is you're going to spend money in order to boost investment, to raise the capacity of the economy so you can let things run faster, will lead back to inflation, higher interest rates, and would be a total disaster. I'm sorry we were cutting across Malcolm a moment ago, because Malcolm and I, he's actually been rather supportive of monetary policy for most of the time, the last 2 or 3 years, and supported a low inflation target. Gordon agreed with my inflation target about a month ago, I think, and is still producing rather peculiar theories on the subject. The fact is I don't agree on the independence of the central bank, but I did agree, always have set a low inflation target. And when my 2 critics imply that somehow these judgments have been political and not economic, I've been in there long enough to test this. 2 years ago, the decisions were taken that determined inflation now. And inflation now is coming down towards 2.5%. It's going to go through that in the course of this year downwards. We have combined that low inflation, contrary to your assertion, with growth and with falling unemployment. And that has been because of the decisions we've taken. Now, I don't have an independent central bank, but I do have a central bank governor with whom I discuss things openly. And there were times almost 2 years ago, where we didn't agree exactly. No two men do. But the difference
if you
now...
think we're in a boom, how can you reject his advice?
Look at the last public advice I got from the governor. Was 0.25% separates us on base rates now. And we both agree that's within the margin of error. We're both pursuing the same policy successfully.
That's too
that is a transformation compared to the past. When we had Labour chancellors in the past, they'd have given their eye teeth to talk about figures of inflation and interest rates that we now have. And for the general public, they see the lowest mortgage rates they've had for 30 years, combined with low inflation, which gives them the confidence to expect stable and sustainable growth, which is what we're going to get out of the present economic...
All right, Gordon Brown, you want to get in?
But why, if this is a recovery to last under present circumstances, is investment so low? Why has it risen so slowly out of recession? Why are we 8% down on manufacturing investment last year? Now, these are not the conditions for a sustained boom. These are the conditions that make for a recovery that doesn't last. You need the investment for the future. Why are you not ensuring that that investment is there?
Business investment as a whole is rising strongly, and investment expectations are very high. Investment is created not by governments, not by the kinds of things that Labour governments used to do or you would do. Investment is created by optimism in stable economic conditions, by having healthy balance sheets, by having the kind of thing which British business now has. We get more out of investment now. It isn't just the quantity of investment, it's our productivity, it's our performance. Look at the outputs that we're getting from our economy as it's now invested. And you'll see output is 10% up compared with the last election, compared with 1992, and you'll see Britain competitive, doing extremely strongly. Your device is to say you won't need to be as strict on inflation, strict on monetary policy as the governor, Malcolm Bruce, I would say, because you have some remedy for investment. Dangerous stuff.
Gentlemen, we must move on to our next topic. That's very exciting, but there are other important topics. And the next important topic we must look at is Europe and the single currency. Gordon Brown, you personally want to join the EMU, don't you?
Well, in principle, there are great advantages, of course, but there are difficulties as well. And I've set these British economic tests. We must meet, of course, the Maastricht criteria. That looks unlikely, indeed very unlikely, for many countries in Europe at the moment, but we must also apply the British economic tests. And we must look at the effect on jobs, look at the effect on investment, look at the effect on our financial services industry, look at whether our economic cycle is in line with the rest of Europe, look at whether we can have the sufficient flexibility to avoid the shocks. Now, the test must be the British national economic interest. The problem with the Liberals is they would go in anyway. The problem with the Conservatives is they are so divided, you don't know what they will do, and they cannot make the test the British national economic interest. I suspect Ken Clarke agrees with a lot of what I'm saying, but most of his party unfortunately don't.
I press you further, because is it not extraordinary that here is a situation where we all know that probably within the next 5 years, Britain may well, on this issue, make the most important economic decision, arguably, that it has ever made, which essentially rests on not minute questions of timing, but on fundamental questions of principle. Isn't it extraordinary that neither of the major political parties will tell the voters fair and square which way they intend to jump on this question, though everybody knows that it will happen after the election?
There will be a referendum on the issue if a decision is recommended in the next Parliament. The final decision will rightly be one for the British people. We will apply, as everybody would expect us to do, the test of what is in the national economic interest. Now, there is
Why don't you know now?
Well, there's a great deal still to be known about whether we will meet the Maastricht criteria on inflation rates, interest rates, on public spending, on the share of national debt. There's also a great deal to be known about how the business cycle is likely to go. There's a lot to be known about changes that we want to see in Europe, and greater flexibility in the labour markets and everything else. Now, you can't make a decision without looking at all these issues.
You're going to discover all that by the end of 1997?
Well, the right time to do that is next year, yes. The right time is next year.
When the election's behind you.
And I think Ken Clarke would tend to agree with me on all these things. The problem is that his divided cabinet is incapable of making a decision in the national economic interest. The test must be the national economic interest. The people of Britain should and rightly will have the final decision.
All right. Malcolm Bruce. Malcolm Bruce, we know pretty well which way your party wants to go, but why does it want to give away the main tools of economic management to people in Brussels and people in Frankfurt who are not accountable to the British electorate and the British people for the decisions they make?
Well, you use the language of an opponent of the idea, Peter, about people in Brussels and people in Frankfurt.
My job to ask the questions that are in people's minds.
They are people within the European Union of which we're a member, to which we contribute. And I think the important point is, we talk about what will create employment, what will create the climate for investment, what will create the climate for dealing with these issues is low inflation, stability, low interest rates, and a belief that they will stay low. And the reason that we would wish to see that kind of environment prevail is that if you can create the climate where we meet the criteria, the founder members meet the criteria, and the British people back it in a referendum, it will be an opportunity to be in on the ground floor of something that should enable us to strengthen the single market, strengthen investment, strengthen employment, and ensure that the people of this country gain a full benefit from being full members. But we do have to meet the criteria. The founder members have to meet the criteria. And because it's such a big issue, we wholly accept, as do the other parties, that the British people should back it. But we have no doubt at all that provided we've met those criteria, we will be campaigning to persuade people it was in the British national interest. Being half-hearted members of the European Union, half-hearted members of the single market is not in our interest. That's where our trade lies, it's where our opportunity lies, it's where our future lies. And the danger of these two parties is they'll put us on the fringe instead of at the heart of Europe.
Chancellor, you know perfectly well, you got back from Amsterdam today, of course, where you were being finance minister on Britain's behalf. You know perfectly well that you want to join the EMU without any nonsense about waiting for all sorts of weird and wonderful conditions to be fulfilled. It's just the political situation in your party that prevents you from saying so, isn't it?
Absolutely wrong. I would not join the single currency if the convergence rules were disregarded. I think it's extremely important that no countries go into it unless they are so convergent they can benefit from it, from having a common monetary policy, seeking to achieve lower interest rates, handing over power actually to their own central bank governors rather than the people you described, over monetary policy only. But the key thing is that at the moment, having come back from this meeting, the people of France don't know at the moment whether they're going to be in or not. The people of Germany don't know. The people of Italy don't know. The people of Spain don't know, or Denmark. They know what their governments are pursuing, but there are a great number of uncertainties around this project. We have a perfectly clear policy of remaining involved in those events. I was in Amsterdam with all these other finance ministers yesterday precisely to continue put in British influence in the negotiations, keep a hand on events, and to keep what we've got, which the others haven't, which is the right which John Major negotiated to exercise our own option at the right time. And that option should be exercised on the basis of fitting in with all the hopes and expectations I have for economic policy for this government. If I am pursuing an aim of getting not only jobs and prosperity, but making this country the most successful industrial economy in Western Europe, I want to be involved in these discussions with the other finance ministers. Our influence should at least as big there as any other member, and we should make our decision on our economic interests, then, as we all agree, put it to the public if the government, of course, the next Parliament, decides that it wishes to go into the EMU and the single currency.
Not a cigarette paper between him and you, is that
well, if I may say so, I think we're all
Well, I think I'm rather clear about what's going on, actually, and I think we've spent so much time refining our policy. I mean, Robin Cook's come out with a statement today, Gordon, you'll be glad to know, that if we don't join in 1999, you won't join during the next Parliament. That doesn't seem to make any sense to me. I doubt that it does to you, but it's another case of policy being made on the hoof.
No, I've read what Robin Cook says, and I agree with it. The problem for you, Ken, is you come back to report to your cabinet, and they disagree with everything that you say. You're in a complete minority. I think all of us agree that there are formidable obstacles. All of us agree at the moment, for many countries, it's highly unlikely. The question, unfortunately, for the Conservative Party is, if re-elected, do we have any idea on what basis they will make the decision? Because they are so divided on this issue that they're now issuing separate manifestos all over the country. And I think Ken Clarke would have to confirm that.
Well, I think there are manifestos all over the country by Labour Party candidates saying they're opposed to privatisation, which your party has been for as long as I can remember. And I think the last time we tackled you on your black hole in finances, you suddenly discovered you might be in favour of privatisation, even of the air traffic control system. We have a set policy of the government, how we exercise the option, and we've been pursuing that quite steadily and remorselessly. That's the policy I was pursuing in Amsterdam yesterday.
Are there not dangers in being outside it? Do you not acknowledge, for example, that if the others go ahead and we don't, that that could have serious implications for inward investment to the United Kingdom, which at the moment attracts more than most other countries in the European Union, who might question whether or not being inside the United Kingdom but the wrong side of currency union was to their advantage, and that secondly, the City of London's role as the leading European financial centre could also be compromised. Is there not a danger of our being excluded from that?
The reason we keep the option open is because we have to make a judgment on what is best for our jobs, our prosperity, our continued attraction of inward investment. I think all of us should want, in principle, I hope it's not too platitudinous, to participate as a country in all those things that will enable us to continue to be an industrial and economic success, and to keep out of those things that are likely to go wrong, not work, and take us away from that goal. And at this stage, it's far too soon to know when the single currency is going ahead, whether it will go ahead, who the member states will be, and the economic judgments that will start to be made later this year are, even now, I think, peculiarly difficult to read across the continent. We're in the best position, any of the major states, because we have our option, and we are going to judge things by our national economic
Gordon Brown, I want to move us on to our next topic, but just finish up on that if you want to.
Well, I think we'd all accept the difficulties of making this decision, keeping the option open, but recognizing that things are unlikely for many countries at the moment. But the question I think the Conservatives must answer, 3.5 million jobs depend on Europe, 60% of our trade. If we have Conservatives in the Cabinet seriously consider withdrawing from the single market, withdrawing from parts of Europe, what future for jobs, what future for investment? Now, I know Ken Clarke disagrees with them all, but how can you elect a government? You don't even know where they stand on the fundamental issue of membership of the single market.
All right, we must now move on to unemployment, because there is no group of people whose interest is greater in what you gentlemen are going to do than those who are or may be unemployed. Gordon Brown, you're relying on a big reduction in unemployment, what you call less spending on the economic and social failures, to finance a lot of the extra things that you want to spend money on. But you've rejected the only quick-acting mechanism there is for bringing about big changes in unemployment, which is expanding the economy, what you call tax and spend. So is there not a hopeless credibility problem about your claim, on the one hand, to be going to have extra money by reducing what is wasted on the dole, as you put it, and on the other hand, your refusal to use the only method that would actually bring that about?
I'm making no public spending commitments beyond those in the manifesto. What I am saying, however, is it is possible, as in America, as in other countries, to reduce the numbers of long-term and young unemployed. Now, is it not a scandal that 650,000 young people under 25 in this country are without a job, not in training, no work experience, doing absolutely nothing? Can we not do something about it? Does it not harm our communities? Is it not a waste of economic potential? And that's why I think most people, sensible people around the country, indeed the churches have a report coming out on Tuesday, support our measures to deal with the problems of youth unemployment. And is it not a scandal that where 10% of the unemployed are long-term unemployed in America, it is nearly 40% in Britain, unemployed for more than a year, lost to the labour market, drifting out of work. Now, you cannot have a successful society where you have nearly 800,000 people being unemployed for all this time, and where you have second-generation unemployment. Now, that's why we'll do something about it. It benefits us all because we reduce social security bills, then we get people back to work, we cut the problems that have led to the 22 tax rises under the Tories. You create a virtuous circle where instead of people being paid dole by all of us, 20% of working-age families, nobody in work, we have people back into work paying taxes themselves.
But, Mr. Brown, you've missed the focus of my question. It's not why should you care about the unemployed. We all know why you should care about the unemployed. The question is, how can you pretend that you're going to save serious, large sums of money on the dole when the only measures that you're proposing, you are proposing measures to deal with unemployment, are the kind that might have some effect over 25 years, but can only have marginal effects in the lifetime of one parliament, and therefore are not going to ease your budgetary problem?
I disagree entirely. Nobody is saying that our measures to use a windfall levy on the privatised utilities to raise substantial sums of money for a $3 billion employment programme to get young and long-term unemployed back to work will fail to get them back to work. That is the task. Private employers invited to take people on, a tax incentive to do so, an environmental task force for young people to get them into work, new training opportunities for those who've missed these opportunities. Now, that will get young people into work. I disagree with your proposition that it will not work. It will get people into work. The experience of the programs are that when you give young people these opportunities, they are kept on by the employer because they see that there is potential in these young people to move forward. Now, that's the only way that you can cut the costs of failure over a long period of time. Cutting social security bills, getting people back to work, it makes absolute sense for our country. It's happened in America, it's happened in other countries, it will happen here.
Michael Bruce, do you have a believable remedy for unemployment that would work within 3, 4, 5 years?
Well, we would certainly accept that making the economy competitive is the underlying most important thing. But on the other hand, to make the economy competitive, you need to invest in research and development and innovation so that you've got products that you can sell abroad, and you've got to train the workforce so they've got skills that will enable them to make these products. And we do have a serious problem in the quality of our education and the inadequacy of training. And I can confirm what Gordon has said in the practicalities, that people say, oh, well, these training initiatives don't in themselves create jobs. But I had one in my own part of the world where employers were persuaded to take on young people, initially rather against their better judgment, and found that they worked themselves into an economically valuable job and were kept on because they were developing useful skills which enhanced the success of that company. So I don't agree that simply educating and training people does not help increase the availability of employment, but I wholly accept you've got to ensure that you remain competitive, you are making things and services which you can sell abroad at a competitive price, and that's why the underlying economic strategy of low inflation, low interest rates, stability and certainty are also necessary.
Let me pursue you about this competitiveness problem and raise with you the problem that's sometimes called globalization, which means the fact that any employer anywhere is free to employ the cheapest labor wherever he can find it in the world and sell the things that he makes in, roughly speaking, the dearest market anywhere in the world. One consequence of that seems to be that something like a fifth, a quarter of the workforce in the industrial world is the unskilled people no longer able to earn what you might call a first world income. They're living on, or only earning subsistence levels of income. Would you, as the Germans and French and the European model do, subsidize them and accept the fact they'll be unemployed, or would you, as the Americans do, say to them, well, if you only earn subsistence, you must live on subsistence?
Well, I think the basic point you have to make is there's no way that people in this country can be expected to live on third world wages, and any economic philosophy that suggested we can compete with third world markets on that basis is doomed to failure. It's totally unacceptable. What we've got to do is add value in this country, use skills, and enable us to develop products which we can sell at a realistic price. What I have to say to you, however, is that employers who cannot create jobs that are not permanently dependent on income support and housing benefit are not creating jobs that are fundamentally viable, and they're costing the rest of the taxpayers billions of pounds. We have to improve the skills base in this country so that we can create jobs that will pay decent wages and compete with the third world because we add more value. It brings us back to the reason why Liberal Democrats believe investing in education is the overriding single most important objective in this country, and it's why we believe we should put a penny on income tax now to put a £10 billion boost into our education, just so we can provide people with the skills that will enable this country to compete.
Chancellor, unemployment today is nearly double what it was when the Conservative Party came into office in 1979. You've made mass unemployment the primary mechanism for the control of inflation insofar as you've achieved that over the last 18 years. Why should you have any credibility on this subject at all?
I'll debate with you another time, Peter. I mean, that is complete nonsense. We've just had an extremely strong recovery for the last 2 or 3 years, during which unemployment's continually fallen. Unemployment's down by over 1 million compared with last time, and it's been falling pretty well every month for the last 12 months, and I think practically every month for about the last 2.5 years.
1.8 million now.
And it's set to continue to do so, yes. Or in the 80s, you look across the Western world, unemployment went up. We're now more successful than our rivals in getting it down. It's created by British business. It's created by business and industry actually taking advantage of a stable economic environment. Governments can support that. We, too, have training schemes. We have greatly increased the staying on rate at school. We have hugely expanded the opportunities in higher education. We're raising the quality of our young workforce. But you do have to have the stable macroeconomic policies as well, which are producing our unemployment in a way which is the envy of the rest of Western Europe. That's what we have to continue to do, because I quite agree that the main problem today is those in work find it more difficult to feel secure in their job in today's competitive world, and out of work you have people who are waiting the best cure for poverty, deprivation, social malaise in the inner cities. All the other things require jobs in a modern economy. What you can't do, with the greatest respect, is say you found a great new wheeze that raises a huge tax, that collects £3 billion worth of taxation and more, spend that on a variety of schemes and job subsidies, say you've wiped out $250,000 off the unemployment figures, and you've saved a lot of money, which is the Labour Party's alternative to our present picture. Real economic policy is required to deliver secure jobs, and that's what we are.
Gordon Brown?
But Ken, you accepted something had to be done in your budget before last. You said you would do something for the long-term unemployed. You would create 130,000 places a year by cutting the national insurance rebate. In actual fact, I find you've created 1,179 jobs from it. Now, you accepted there was a problem, but you didn't do anything approaching the scale of the problem. Now, why don't you accept that if we continue with this situation, 20% of working-age families have nobody earning a wage? That is a huge cost to us all in higher social security bills and higher taxes. We must do something about it.
Gordon, that's very clever, particularly the way at the end you turn around to cue your applause, but you actually took one little bit. I did get some. New Labour has some skills, there's no doubt. But you've taken a tiny little bit out of a package you supported. You complained about that bit, said I was delaying it. I had a whole package, it is true, mainly based on family credit, mainly based on increasing the child care allowance for women who wish to get into work, low-paid jobs.
You wanted and didn't achieve it.
We have reduced long-term unemployment. Our youth unemployment is far below the level of other major states in Western Europe.
Double that of Germany.
I wish to continue to do that.
This election
is about jobs. Since you promised the windfall tax to wipe out, you said, 250,000 unemployed, unemployment's come down by 400,000 even since you made that promise, and it's come down because of our economic policy.
Now, Mr. Clarke, you mustn't hog the discussion, nor must Mr. Brown. I want to move on to our last topic very briefly now, which is growth, and ask Malcolm Bruce, do you believe that you can accelerate the long-term growth rate of this country, or do you believe with the Green Party that we probably shouldn't be trying to do that?
Well, I certainly don't think you can accelerate in the way we're doing it at the moment, because it's unsustainable. There is an economy like ours cannot grow at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9% a year. But it could grow a little bit faster if we it got all the indicators moving in the right direction. And there are real benefits, because even a 0.25% improvement in GDP gives about £6.5 billion of extra revenue. And that's very significant. So the question is, how do you sustain growth and avoid boom and bust? Because what undermines people in this country more than anything else is uncertainty and insecurity. It's not just unemployment, it's the fear of unemployment. It's not the mortgage rate, it's the fear of negative equity. And boom and bust have delivered insecurity in jobs and negative equity. What people would like is a stable, predictable, steady growth at a moderate level. And that can be achieved by good economic management, which is free of the kind of boom-bust policies which we've suffered from over the last 50 years.
Let me throw it fairly briefly now, please, to Gordon Brown. Labour has never succeeded any more than the Tories have in accelerating the long-term growth rate of this country. It's stuck 2 to 2.25% ever since the war. Why should anybody think you can make it any faster?
It actually averaged 2.9% until 1979. It has averaged 1.9% since 1979. And I think the Conservatives must explain why 2 very deep recessions have lowered the growth rates of the economy. Now, of course, it's difficult. You need investment for the long term. You need stability so that people can invest. You need reform of the welfare state, and you need investment in our skills, particularly in education. But it can be done, and I believe that Britain can do better.
Kenneth Clarke, the same question to you. Why should anybody believe that you can achieve this magical effect? Growth is no faster now than it was when you took over 18 years ago.
Well, at the moment, growth in this country, as I think you'll acknowledge, is far faster than that of any other major Western European country. The OECD, the IMF, not just me, say the conditions we've created are the best for sustainable growth with low inflation that this country's seen for about 30 years. In fact, this is the first recovery almost since the war where we have finally combined growth, falling unemployment, rising living standards, and low inflation. That is sustainable.
Sorry to interrupt you, but it is now time for the final statements. And you having drawn lots, I call upon Gordon Brown to make his closing statement.
I said at the outset that the real task for Britain is to equip ourselves for the future. Stability, investment in education, reform of the welfare state, leading as a country again in Europe. And that is what a Labour government would do. Labour has no public spending promises that require extra taxes. Our programme is costed carefully, as the Institute of Fiscal Studies has confirmed. We have now debated for almost an hour with the other parties, and the questions do remain. Why, if everything is so good for a recovery at last, is manufacturing investment falling as it did last year? Why are 20% of working-age families with no one earning a wage? How can we trust the Conservatives when they broke all their tax promises, like on VAT in 1992? Where will the money come from to pay for their unfunded promises that they've been making out of desperation in the last week. These are questions that Ken Clarke should answer now. The Labour Party, however, has made a bond of trust with the British people. We will deliver what we promise and not promise what we cannot deliver. We will live up to the people's trust.
Thank you. Thank you, Gordon Brown. Malcolm Bruce.
Well, in the last election, people voted for something which they were promised and then found out it didn't work and they were disappointed. What they're now telling us is they don't believe that the government can deliver further tax cuts. They don't believe that the Labour Party can fund its programme on the current tax levels, and yet they say that they might choose one of them as a government. And what we're saying to people is, if you accept that there is a genuine crisis of funding in the health service or in education, that in spite of the very rosy picture the Chancellor paints, we have not been able to justify his tax cuts because public services have been starved of necessary investment, then you should recognise that you need to back a programme that will give priority to finding the money to deal with that crisis, and at the same time to ensuring that we bring down inflation and create the climate for sustained investment, free from political interference, based on objective economic criteria that have been successful in other countries and that have been a single missing factor that have caused the British economy to suffer successive booms and busts. If you agree that Britain's interest lies in a constructive relationship within the European Union to maximise our trade, to ensure that we can continue to attract overseas investment, and that the City of London maintains its preeminence as Europe's leading financial institutions, then you should back a party that's got a clear and positive attitude to ensure that if a great enterprise goes ahead on conditions which we've agreed with and we can contribute and participate, we should do so as long as the British people back that recommendation. And if you want a party that is clearly prepared to address the green agenda, to deal with the problems of asthma and pollution and the choking of our cities, then you should vote for a party that has got an agenda which will put taxes on those pollution and use the yield of that taxes, all of it, to bring down the cost on jobs and wealth creation, such as national insurance and VAT. In other words, you should vote for a party that will really make a difference.
Malcolm Bruce, thank you very much. Your final thoughts, Chancellor.
Well, we're back to gloom and crisis again from the Labour and Liberal spokesman, and I don't think that is reality. They've got to make their minds up where the economy is. Our record is extremely good. We have produced growth with falling unemployment. We've combined it with low inflation. I could have said we've combined it with a healthy balance of payments, never done in this country before. The key thing is to look forward now, how to sustain it. To do it in a sustainable way, the green references I've never picked up before, but I think I'm about the greenest Chancellor since the war, and I think a reasonably successful one as well, because I had the landfill tax, which I've reintroduced, used to reduce the tax on jobs, national insurance contribution of employers. I've actually introduced tax relief for low-sulphur diesel. Sustainable growth and development in this country to make Britain an attractive place to live is the objective of sound economic policy. The threat comes from these July budgets. These two both want an emergency budget in July in order to change the policies, and they haven't really revealed much. Malcolm wants to put my last income tax reductions back in order to spend it on education. I don't know why he doesn't want to put the one before back. He promised that, but apparently not the tuppence, just a penny back. Gordon has enormous gaps in his policies. One that he slipped by, £2.5 billion a year on a generous low estimate of increased council house building, which his colleagues are committed to. He will not tell us whether that's going to be paid for by tax or by borrowing. The privatisation receipts he lacks, £1.5 billion worth. 12 billions in total he lacks. In July, it wouldn't just be the windfall tax, the other taxes, but that would merely be part of a change of economic policy that will put our achievements at risk.
Mr. Clarke, gentlemen. I thank you all very much indeed. And that's it for this debate. I hope you've enjoyed it. We may have discovered the first green Chancellor of spring. I'll be back next Sunday with the first of 3 programmes looking at the critical issues facing Britain over the next 5 years, whether or not they feature in the formal debate between the parties. That's Vote Now, Pay Later, next Sunday at 8:15 p.m. here on BBC 2. Until then, from all of us, good night for now.